All right, welcome to Tech Talks. Our IT edition today is focused on sharing some best practices around performing service decompositions ahead of building services in ITSI. In case you don't know, Tech Talks are a series of short webinars that are more deep dive focused for our technical practitioners. We absolutely value you and we want you to continue your Splunk journey. So our experts create these best practices and we want you to leverage them in your daily roles. Okay, so I suppose the right thing to do is to start with some introductions. So my name is Jeff Wiedemann. I am an IT operations strategist and an ITSI subject matter expert, and I'm joined by Chris. Chris, why don't you introduce yourself?
Hi, everybody. I'm Chris Klein. I'm an IT specialist, and I focus on how to take the world of Splunk and apply it into IT and observability use cases.
Awesome. Okay, so from an agenda perspective, we're going to start quickly with defining, what is an ITSI service, what is this process of service decomposition, and why should we do it? We're going to then spend most of the talk going over what the approach is, some of the best practices, and hopefully some of the pitfalls that we think you need to avoid. We'll end with some examples of what good looks like, as well as share with you guys some additional resources that you can consume after this tech talk and some possible next steps. Okay, so Chris, service decomposition. This sounds like something that happens when I throw something out and it's got banana peels in it and it's in a compost bin and all that. What is service decomposition? Maybe you can quickly tell us what is an ITSI service. Walk us through what that is and kind of what is this high-level three-step process that our customers need to go through.
A service decomposition, or sometimes we say service decomp, is the idea of taking the layers apart from a business service all the way down to its component IT services underneath and linking them together. It is different than what you would find in a CMDB or maybe an APM service map. It's about linking business and IT together and answering the questions of what do I need to model and what things need to go into that model.
Yeah, awesome. I think one of the things that we'll harp on through the course of this tech talk is the importance of defining, a service that is valuable to the business. I think that's what we're going to hit on in the next couple of slides. But we want to make sure that everybody understands that in order for ITSI to be successful and to be differentiated from, some of the other infrastructure monitoring tools or APM tools that you have, we're talking about taking something that's important and valuable to the business and representing it at a fairly high level. That's what ITSI was purpose-built to do. So, Chris, let's talk about this, start with business function and flow. Let's get into what that actually means to our customers. So my guess is, most of the folks listening to this tech talk are either Splunk admins or ITSI administrators, or just have kind of a more technical bend to them. So help those folks in your best techie speak understand what is a good service? What do we mean when we talk about elevating that service up to being something that's business focused and picking something that's critical to the business? What do we mean by that? And how can these folks that are listening to this tech talk help choose and define the right type of service for ITSI?
Good services are based on the outcomes of your business or organization. They're based on answering the question, who cares, until you get to the ultimate answer. And then tying that, whether it's any of the orange things that you see here or anything that's uniquely different to your organization, back down to the underlying IT components, whether they be cloud, on-prem, virtual, or otherwise. It doesn't matter. We're going to connect the technical to the outcomes. Your outcomes are going to be based upon the things that get you a bonus, things that make your customers happy, things that make your company money. It's things that the organization exists to support.
Exactly. And another way of looking at it is like, if the name of your top level services in ITSI are things that the CIO and the CEO know by name, it's probably the right business service. But if it's something that they have never heard of before, it might be, too low of a level or too technical. So just another litmus test. Okay, so we've driven home the point of making sure that we choose a service that is business focused and critical to a customer's organization. Then we get into this process of actually defining what this service looks like, both in scope and depth. And so Let's talk a little bit about that now, Chris. So I know that you use this particular visualization as you're communicating, to folks during a service decomposition of the types of things we want to try to measure and model. So can you walk us through what's going on in this particular slide and how you use this to get all altitudes of monitoring for our business service?
If you think about all the different sources of data that you might be putting into Splunk or want to put into Splunk, they fall into one of these three different levels or altitudes. And frequently, as a practitioner, you're going to focus more on the lower part of this pyramid. The goal is to push up into application and always to business as much as you can, and then look from the top down, so that we're not just looking at more network and storage and cloud sources down at the bottom, but we're looking at the customer sat, the first call resolution in my call center, or other things that would, for example, determine whether an executive might get their bonus at the end of the year. We want to measure those things and then tie them back to the user experience through APM and synthetics and application logs, and then down into the underlying infrastructure. If you think about how your service might be composed, you're going to pick and do a bit from each one of these three levels.
Yep. And, the one key point I think I want to leave everybody with, especially knowing that they're probably technically minded, if your KPIs are primarily CPU, disk, and memory, and that's all you have in ITSI, you're not doing it right. You have to elevate above that infrastructure level and start to understand what are the applications doing, and who's consuming them and how, and are they performing the job that they're supposed to be. So it's not that CPU, disk, and memory are necessarily bad KPIs. It's just that we have to do more than just that. So, this is another representation of that previous slide. This one has maybe a little more detail. Chris, is there anything specific about this representation that you want to talk about?
So the rectangles that you see here are showing all the different kinds of sources that are going to measure interesting things that you might want to pick from. Think of this as like a pick list as you want to build a service. And as you're choosing it, the different layers you were just looking at, you can see them in the pink on the left side there. They're measuring things from availability all the way up to outcomes at the top. You want to make sure you're spend discrete time at each one of those levels, so that you're pulling in some KPIs and sources that will help you to figure out whether your powered by layer at the bottom is working right, and whether your application layer is working because the code is doing its job and the middleware is behaving correctly. You're going to have APM type data there. Then you move up to quality of service. We're thinking not only are the lights on, but what am I doing as a result of this service being on? Can I watch a show? Can I order a book? Can I do the thing, not just as the process running? And finally, at the top, how many people bought books? How many people watched a show? Were they happy when they did it? Did they come back and buy more? What are the different KPIs that illustrate the outcomes and whether this organization is meeting its goals?
Yep. Yeah, it makes a lot of sense. And Chris, I have a quick story I want to share about the importance of elevating your KPIs inside of ITSI. I used to manage a development team that was developing a web-based application, and we pushed code to production. And one of the things that the developers accidentally did was they disabled or hid a submit button on one of the workflows. And so if you think about it, as soon as that code went to production, nothing was wrong at the infrastructure layer, CPU, disk, memory, that was all fine. Nothing was wrong at the application layer. The application was up and running correctly. But at the end of the day, a critical workflow could not be executed because of the nature of the software change that was there. And the only way that we would ever be able to determine or detect that type of a problem is by looking at the health of the service at that activity and business layer to understand, are users able to do the thing that they're supposed to be able to do within this application?
Bingo. Great example.
Yep. Okay, so we've talked about the importance of identifying a service that's valuable to the business at the highest level. And, we've also talked about, once we define that service, looking at it from more than just an infrastructure level, but infrastructure, application, and even those business metrics. Now we're down to the part of actually pulling together people and getting this information out of them. So Chris, quickly kind of walk us through. Our customers are going to sit down and start to do this service decomposition exercise. What does that look like for them? How do they do it? Who do they bring together? What should they expect? That type of thing.
The first thing is that you have to be sure you're bringing together people from both IT and business. And it's easy to find the right folks from the previous chart from IT, who's responsible for each of those different rectangles in the lower part of the chart. But if you think about the upper part, it can be a little more challenging to figure out who's going to come from my call center, who's going to come that represents customer satisfaction, who feels the pain when things aren't going so well. These are folks who are outside of IT and are often considered to be your customer or your customer's customer in some cases. Bring the leaders if you can, but bring the practitioners from the customer experience as well, so that they can talk about a problem and how they experienced that problem, how a not so good day went, in addition to what we see from the IT side. And if you can bring those two groups together, then you'll find that this experience is much more rich.
Awesome. Cool. Okay, so we've got all of the people that we want to, participate in this service decomposition exercise. And Chris, what would you say? Maybe is it a 1 hour thing? Is it a 5 hour thing? I mean, what timing wise, what are we looking at here?
If you're doing it in person, I'd say you can do it between 1 and an hour and 90 minutes, probably. If you're doing it on Zoom, it does take longer just by the nature of the experience, and it might take maybe a couple hours, even more, depending on how you interact. If you do happen to do it on Zoom or some kind of a remote online experience, I encourage you to take a look at Google's Jamboard product, which is a free online whiteboarding tool that allows you to simultaneously edit on a whiteboard. And that can be a really helpful way when you can't all be in the same room.
Awesome. Okay, cool. So yeah, let's actually walk through kind of what's happening on the whiteboard. What does this process look like once everybody is together in the room? All right, so you've decided on a service, or maybe you have a couple of different services in mind. And so we're going to start to list those out and figure out which are the ones that we want to perform that service decomposition on. So we have a couple of different options here. Maybe we're thinking about doing a DNS service, or we're thinking about doing modeling the health of our online store, or perhaps the health of our ERP system. Well, one of the first questions we want to ask to validate that we do have an appropriately high-level business services, does it impact revenue, does it impact customers, that type of thing. And DNS, directly speaking, does not impact that. Indirectly, it may, and so it may be a good subservice or child service, but not a good top-level service. So we have online store and ERP. Well, one of the next questions we may want to ask ourselves is, do we already have this data in Splunk, or can we get access to the data? It's worth mentioning that if we can't pull the data into Splunk, then we really can't model the health of that particular service inside of ITSI. And if we want to fast track the service to go model, we may want to choose a service that already has some data inside of Splunk. Okay, so our ERP system, while it might be a great business service to model, we don't have that data in Splunk. And so we are going to focus in on the online store as the service that we are going to do some service decomposition on. Chris, anything you want to add so far?
Nope, keep going.
Awesome. Okay. One of the first questions we're going to ask ourselves is, have we had any recent problems with this service or recent outages? Let's go document these things on the board. Chris, you're big about this. What do you want to add to this process here of identifying problems at the beginning of this decomposition exercise?
You're going to ask the question of what happened on a day when the online store didn't work so well. And as you do that, it's going to lead you to other questions that are going to help you to figure out how these pieces all fit together. So in our example, we saw that the transactions weren't going through, and that as a result, we had lots of people calling into our call center.
Right. Yep. Okay. What's the impact of these outages, right? $46,000 per week lost in revenue. Sometimes, ideally, when outages happen, we have a good idea of their impact, whether it's a dollar amount or something else. It's important to understand that because we want to be able to show that and model that as our service within our service in ITSI. The next thing that we're going to do is we understand that the online store is supported by a whole bunch of different sub-services, right? The online store is supported by the web tier. The web tier is supported by our middleware applications, which may be supported by our database application. And also the online store can be accessed via the mobile tier, okay? And also we have external calls that are coming in, right? And so, Chris, one of the things that I think is a pitfall of service decompositions is when you start to do this, what depends on what, your spider web of dependencies can grow very, very big and your scope can explode. What can you tell our customers on how to manage scope explosion during a service decomposition?
I think when you're starting to write them up on the board, it's okay to put as many as come to you and put them up there. Don't confuse that with an intention that you're going to model every single one of these things, but you maybe want to see how the placeholders are, and don't be afraid to go in and remove things that either feel like they're too small or maybe a little bit redundant. For example, you want to, if you take an example of like the human body, I want to know that the knee bone connects to the leg bone. I don't need to know about all the muscles that are in there and the names of the bones and all that other stuff that would be perhaps all the way down to a more microscopic level. You want to keep this at a level that helps you to understand, keep asking the question, is the online store doing good or bad? And if it's doing bad, what other information do I need to know to triage that problem and get it into the right hands and solve it quickly? And then you'll resist that temptation to go too deep.
Okay, cool. And I really, really like the idea that we want to allow ourselves the latitude during the service decomposition to define everything that connects to everything, but be clear that we're not necessarily going to try to take all that on, because that can be a monumental task. And so once you have the system defined at a high level, maybe at that point in time, when you're done, you start to scope down what are the most important things, or what are the things that we want to start with first. So I think that's great feedback. Okay, so then once we start to understand what the online store depends on from a service dependency perspective, now we're starting to get into defining the KPIs, or key performance indicators, that are measuring the health of each of these different services and sub-services. So Chris, what guidance do you have on some best practices around KPI identification, generally speaking?
Remember, a KPI is nothing more than a search in Splunk, and you can search any data that you can put in Splunk, and that KPI must simply return a number, and you're going to run that KPI every X number of minutes or hours. So it really gives you a wide berth to pull from. The best KPIs are the things that would be like the indicators on the dashboard of your car. So I don't need to know every single specific thing about a specific service or subservice. I want to know, is it working okay or not? And so generally, you're not going to have more than 6, 8, or 10 KPIs for your average service, and they should be the equivalent of that check engine light. So you could have a CPU, disk, and memory measurement for some of these lower level things. It's entirely okay to do that for a database or a middleware. But in addition, I want to know, how do I know that my middleware or my database is operating correctly? So that might be things like the average response time of calls, or the number of transactions that is going through as compared to normal, the number of errors that is happening in those systems. And then you apply that same logic as you go higher, but instead of using the average response time, you might have the total number of orders, or the number of customer feedback or sentiment, or things that are measured at the higher level that would be equivalent to the number of errors or things like that.
Yeah, and Chris, you said 5, 8, 10 KPIs. The fewer, the better, generally speaking, right? I'm a fan of maybe 5 at the upper end. And one of the ways that you can really identify what are the most important KPIs is, let's say that we're talking to folks who are responsible for the health of the web tier. You can ask them, what is the first thing? If somebody tells you that your web tier is broken right now, what's the first thing, or the first 2 or 3 things that you're going to go look and check on to determine that web tier is broken or is healthy? Whatever those initial things that people look at, that's going to be an indication of the type of data that you want to pull into Splunk, and the type of KPI that you want to build in ITSI to tell you if that application, or if that part of the service is healthy or not.
That's great. And that just keeps applying as you go down. So if you think about the database, if you call, and some of you will smile about this because you've experienced this, if you call a DBA and say, I think the database has a problem, your DBA is going to go check a few things and say, hold on a second. What things are they checking? And then if those things suggest that there's a problem, then they're going to dig in deeper. So we're not trying to bring in everything about the database, but we want to know what's happening in the infrastructure, good or bad. What's happening in the database overall performance, good or bad? What's happening in the throughput? Do I have errors? You can see how you could limit that to 5 or 6 pretty easily. That helps you to know, should I dig in deeper? That's really the question you're trying to answer.
I know, and this is why we sometimes hate on CPU, disk, and memory, because if you ask somebody who owns, a service, what the first thing they're going to go look at is, a lot of times they don't say CPU, disk, and memory, because those aren't necessarily the most important KPIs, right? And so as we start to, talk to the different groups that are responsible for the different portions of this service, we start to pull in all of these different KPIs at different levels that represent the true health of your service, right? One of the other best practices that I'd recommend is as people identify KPIs that are important to them, it's important to document, what person is that KPI important to, or who owns that particular service, because as you start onboarding that data into Splunk or defining that KPI or the threshold, you might want to go back to that person or that group to have them provide some input on that, okay? So this is kind of what it might look like as we define multiple different KPIs for a given service. Now, the next question we have is, do we have the data in Splunk? Well, if we don't have the data in Splunk, then we can't create the KPIs for that right now. So we might choose to not include those KPIs, or this might represent a bill of work that we have to go and onboard data in Splunk for, so that we can build those KPIs. Now, this is an amazing capability of IT service intelligence that so many of our customers don't necessarily take advantage of or take full advantage of. And that is that each part of a complex system is oftentimes being monitored by external monitoring tools. And those external monitoring tools might do a pretty good job of measuring the health of different pieces and parts of our larger service, and we're going to keep them in place. But with ITSI, that's fine. Keep those external monitoring tools in place, but take the alerts that those monitoring tools are producing and bring them into Splunk so that they can become part of your overall service build. So what we're going to do is we're going to identify the external monitoring tools that are monitoring different parts of our business service, and we're going to onboard those alerts so that those alerts can be embedded directly within the service inside of ITSI for greater visibility as to the health of the service. Chris, anything you want to add there?
Nope.
Awesome. Okay. So once again, what alert sources do we have in Splunk? If we don't have them in there, then we can't represent those, or that's data that we have to go ahead and onboard. Okay. And so it starts to look like this when we get everything done. We have defined at the top level a service of great importance to our business. We have identified the different subcomponents associated with that critical service. We have identified multiple KPIs and alert sources that represent the health of that service. And so if you start to look at, have we hit on these key the key things that we've driven home? Do we have a problem worth solving? Yes, we do. We've identified the online store, which is critical to our business as being a service that we want to monitor, right? We've identified the supporting services as well as the interdependencies between them, right? We have also identified the KPIs that we want to go and build and the data sources associated with them. And finally, we've identified the relevant alerts and the data sources that go with them, okay? And so this is really the output of what you would see on the whiteboard in a service decomposition exercise. Chris, is that right? Is this kind of what you'd expect to see? Is there anything you want to add to what this process looks like?
This is exactly what you'll come up with, and this becomes the blueprint of what you'll build in the tool. So before you do any actual building, you need to now take what's on the board here, and you're going to ask the question, the last big problem that we had, whichever you're using as kind of your litmus test, if that problem were to happen again, from the information on the board, could I tell A, that I have a problem? Could I tell B, where I need to triage that problem, who needs to get involved, and see, could they dig down very quickly, either with the data that's in Splunk or by linking to an external tool source, could they get to the root cause of that? And if the answer isn't yes to all three of those questions, then you need to iterate on what's here on the board. And that happens very frequently until you feel like you've got the right collection of services, KPIs, and alert sources so that you can say yes to those things.
Awesome. Once you're done with this, probably obvious, but take a picture of it, right? So we want to start documenting what we've done. Take a picture of what that whiteboard looks like. Also, here's an example of taking that and putting it inside an Excel spreadsheet. We understand that we've hit different layers. We have the data sources that we want to pull in, the KPIs that we want to build, whether the data is in Splunk or not, who the owner is, that type of thing. So this is all good documentation to produce at the end of a service decomposition. And really from this, you have the ability then to go and use that information to build your KPIs, build your services, create your service dependencies. You know what data sources to onboard, and you're going to be able to then build artifacts in ITSI that are valuable for the service owners and the line of business owners. You're going to be able to build episodes in ITSI that are valuable to the operations team in IT operations, and you're going to be able to represent the health of a critical application that is relevant to and important to executives and the C-level. So we're just about done here. What does this look like when you're done? Here is a real world glass table example from Dell, who uses ITSI to monitor their retail for Black Friday events, right? So this is kind of what this glass table could look like, and how valuable would something like this be to the high level executives in the company, right? This is the real value add of ITSI, is being able to produce a glass table that looks like this. And similarly, here is a glass table from retail banking. And you'll notice here, as we've been talking about the whole time, we have business metrics up at the top, like number of customers that are interacting with our online banking. We have cash that's being withdrawn or deposited, how many ATMs are in use. So this is all business focused metrics. And then of course it's supported by the underlying infrastructure. So by pulling all of this data together, we have the ability to create glass tables that represent the health of the service at multiple different levels. Okay, so that's about all we have time for today. I hope you found that to be valuable. We have several different resources that we're going to leave with you today. The Service Decomposition Leave Behind document is a very comprehensive coverage of what we talked about in the Tech Talk today. We have a video that helps you better understand how to drill down and model business services with ITSI. If your organization has SAP, then you can leverage the Service Insights for SAP package to fast track that service modeling of your SAP environment. And we also have other ITSI content packs that help you build services and service templates for pre-built technologies. And finally, we have our Splunk expert and adoption services for various different things with ITSI. So go ahead and check out that catalog. Don't forget about the incredible Splunk community. So go ahead and head out to community.splunk.com. You can search for ITSI to see best practices that are out there. You can participate in discussions, see other tech talks, and of course, using the Splunk idea space, you can submit or vote on enhancement requests to the product. Thank you very much, and happy Splunking.